Hello, this is Dr. Doug Gilbert. I'm here to talk about academic literature reviews, and specifically the use of a federated search engine in a systematic literature review. In this video we will cover 4 topical areas. First, we will look at literature reviews in context. Second, we'll look at the flow of a systematic literature review. Third, the use of a federated search engine. And last, some helpful resources. In terms of context, Grant and Booth identified 14 types of literature reviews when they surveyed the field in an article published in 2009. Some of the terms found to describe literature reviews were not particularly helpful. For example, literature review, overview, and topics like that don't particularly describe either the method or the approach taken to the review. They're too broad, too generic, and don't provide much insight. However, if we look at several of the terms here, you'll note that systematic appears in 5 of the 14. The mapping review, systematic map, qualitative systematic review, qualitative evidence synthesis, a systematic review, systematic search and review, and systematized review. So what we are starting to see already by 2009 were a number of reviews which were more systematic in process with a described approach, typically documented in a protocol or in a particular flow that would be understandable to the reader. In order to help us understand that in a little more detail, I have created a conceptual categorization of these literature review types. For this categorization, I've taken 13 of the 14 that were described on the prior slide, leaving out the literature review, considering that it is too broad to be of any use. And I've used a 2x2 matrix just to help us understand the basics of how we might categorize these. As is typical for this type of review, or this type of analysis of an XY axis, I've used a vertical axis, which we call the scope of focus, being either thematic or journal in nature, and it can range from narrow to broad. A narrow focus would be on a very few themes or possibly very few journals or a combination thereof, and broad is somewhat the opposite, where you have a fairly wide focus of themes and or journals. Along the X or the horizontal axis, the search methodology structure is looked at, and that can be fairly simple, with a simple search string that's executed once and used no more, or it can be fairly complex. And this approach is a synthesis of the article from Grant and Booth in terms of their 14 types, which we've used 13 in this case, and a more recent article by Gower and Coomer, which looks at the systematic approach and how that has developed over the decades since Grant and Booth published their article. So first, let's look at some things that are a little more on the left-hand side of this categorization. And 3 of those are the rapid review, the overview, which I have subtitled survey, and the scoping review. So these typically have a narrower focus, and they typically have a much more simple approach to search. And let me explain what we mean by both of those. The narrow focus, and rapid review is a good example, is often for a very specific use, say a policy paper or a specific event that has taken place in historical context. So we are not looking for a broad set of themes. We're looking for a specific theme, and maybe even in specific publications, and just to get a rapid temperature check or approach to the area. An overview is a similar thing, often with a slightly broader theme or journal reach in terms of what we look at. It tries to create some type of survey of the field, but again, not a real complex and multi-tiered approach to searching. Scoping reviews are a little more complex in terms of their search methodology because they do try to refine the retrieved data into a more specific set of materials that have evolved. In the middle are something which we could call umbrella reviews. These are looking at broad themes across the area, although they do still have some restrictions. There is a little more complexity in the search methodology, which is needed, and mixed reviews studies or mixed methods reviews are similar, except they often are quite a bit broader in terms of what they cover. Now over on the right are a series of areas which you do see the 5 of the systematic reviews come in there, and they tend to be more complex in the way the searches are carried out, and they tend to be broader in terms of themes or the number of journals included. So let's talk real briefly about some of those, and they do vary a lot within the categories, so this is just suggestive categorization. If we look at the systematized review and the systematic review, a systematized review often has, in terms of what Grant and Booth described, a much narrower focus, typically fewer journals, fewer topics, but it's very systematic in its approach to search. Whereas a systematic review, similar term, but some differences, tends to have a broader reach, often by looking at more journals. Systematic search and review has multiple steps, which can be involved in that review, so it has a little bit more breadth, at least initially, and it may be narrowed down, and a little bit more complexity in terms of the search. Once we get into things such as critical reviews, meta-analysis, and qualitative systematic reviews, then the search methodology becomes more complicated and multi-tiered. And how that may play out is multiple levels of search. So it's taking a first search, retrieving a number of articles, taking a subsequent search against the first set, and maybe even another 1 or 2 refining searches to reduce the number of articles, and then even in certain cases such as meta-analysis, critical reviews, or mapping reviews, moving the search results over to a qualitative data analysis software to do coding and categorization, to look at that in much more depth based on content in the articles and based on things such as keywords and abstracts. There are 3 aspects of literature reviews in any doctoral project, which can be a doctoral project in a practice-based doctorate or a dissertation. First, the student, or the doctoral scholar, as we may call them, needs to do some scoping. They need to look at the conceptual or theoretical frameworks that could be used to support the research they intend to conduct. This is an early stage process. It usually involves reading a lot of different types of journal articles, books, and sources just to get an understanding of the area. It's very important that you carry this out in as systematic a process as possible in order to be sure that you have found things that could be helpful to study the topic. Second is what we often think of as the more traditional literature review in a doctoral context. It is the conceptual or theoretical framework and building that out in terms of looking at its narrative arc over time from seminal literature out to current application relevant to the study. And we should not forget that in any doctoral project, we also have to look at methodology, and we need to support that methodology with a solid set of research which says that the methodology is not only appropriate, that it can be used in this context, but that it will prove something, that it will show some type of results which are helpful and will advance the knowledge. Within each of these 3 areas, the typical approach is fairly similar. It will vary in detail within each of these 5 steps. The scope is determined, look different in a scoping versus methodology. There is then a search component, looking at the results in an appraisal, synthesizing those results typically in a synthesis narrative in the doctoral project, analysis, which is often a conclusion of the literature review in terms of what has been shown in the various areas, and then possibly rerunning the whole thing if necessary. Now, systematic literature review is a bit more complicated, and this diagram begins to show 10 steps that would be involved in a systematic literature review, and the complexity begins at the first 2 steps, and I will go in more detail of those in the following slides. But first we define the thematic clusters. So this is really looking at the areas that we decide need to be studied. And we need to really have some idea of what is out there in the literature and what is happening in the academe in terms of what are the themes being looked at. From there, to get to a search engine, we have to have keywords. And keywords are the operative language that we use in the search to be able to create a result that we can then refine in that systematic literature review Some decision needs to be made about the search databases. This can be prescribed by the university. Some universities prescribe, for example, that any systematic literature review must be done in Scopus and Web of Science. Others are more permissive, and others may require that the documentation of that literature review database is very specific and explicit and relates to the area being studied. A little bit broader, but more documentation required. There needs to be then some organizing method, and this is creating the search string and looking at how you will conduct analysis, conduct the search, download the results, and then there's a process of looking at results, typically several hundred potential sources, and a decision being made on including or excluding. Criteria need to be defined in this area, and we'll talk about that in a later video. We then do a retrieve the included ones, and what we've done here between include or exclude in that decision is we've gone to look for full text or the PDFs quite often, where we then bring in all of the text and we retrieve all of that for those that we decide to include. Some scholars decide to include all the text, although this can be quite cumbersome if you have several thousand sources, and it's best to narrow that down before you actually retrieve the included text. Then you develop an organized list. This can be by thematic clusters, this can be by subgroups. There's a number of ways to do that, and then prepare the synthesis. So how do we get to themes and keywords? Several different ways that we can get there, and that will be the focus of most of the rest of this video. First, there are in the literature many articles that talk about things such as ontologies, taxonomies, and typologies. Very common in the social science and very often used as a way to describe the types of things that are out there. As an example, I work quite often in social construction, constructivism theory of education, and similar types of topics. A favorite word in that area is ontology. So often I will find articles that talk about the ontology of social construction concepts. This helps me find articles and references that define what may be a key word that I want to search on in a systematic review. Other areas like the word taxonomy. Some like the word typology. These words tend to be used interchangeably, even though they can be defined quite differently. But just be aware that in the literature they're often used interchangeably. Another way, and this is very common for practice-based doctorates, is to use the discipline's language that is common. And this is an example from the business area. There have been 4 areas of business education which have been dominant for about 70 years, and they've gone by different names over time. But it is typically in today's world and today's language: organizational behavior, organizational development, OBOD, marketing, finance, which can include accounting as well, and strategy, which can include administration. And there are a few others out there, such as production, operations management, and so forth. But using those disciplines will often get you to a place to find keywords. That brings up the question about how do we do that? The next slide will give us some hints on what that may look like. First, if there is a dominant or strong author or a seminal author, often they will have gone through a process of creating a classification scheme. Henry Mintzberg is one of the masters of doing this. He has a number of books, prolific publications over the years, but he often looks at what is out there, what is occurring in the field, particularly in organizations and management, and describes them in categorizing terms. His books can be used to create a keyword list that's used in a systematic literature review. Some things don't change over time. As an example, Henry Fayol, who lived from 1841 to 1925, had, among his other things, 5 functions of administration. This is still taught today in many administration and business courses and can be the source of looking for sources and keywords. So how do we do that in the library? Let's look. So let's say that I took a topic that Henry Mintzberg has recently published about, which is on rebalancing society. He has 2 or 3 books in that area right now and several other scholarly publications, and I did a search. And I found this article with these 4 authors. Note that they're mainly from Latin America, and one from France. But within the returned article, so I'm looking at the article here, usually in PDF, you'll note that the keywords are listed, and that's common in most publishers' databases. So this gives us some indication of keywords that may be around and may help us describe certain variants or certain areas that we want to look at in rebalancing society. It could be a geographic focus. It may be Latin America, it may be elsewhere, but it's interesting to see that we're starting to break that out. There may be progressive leaders. So this may indicate some types of leadership theories that would be more prevalent in this idea of rebalancing society. And complex problems may give us a hint that we need to look at decision-making theory to come up with keywords to do a systematic review of literature in the area of rebalancing society. Another way to find keywords is when articles are retrieved, there is a short synopsis. In this case is a book, not too much different for articles, but there are descriptors. And these descriptors often provide words that we can use to then drill down, click on them if you want to, and find various things, which will give us keywords. There's also keywords, you note below, but descriptors are a different way, an alternative way to come to a set of keywords. This is a process that you have to do with a little bit of trial and error, with retrieving things from the library, looking at them, looking for patterns, and not believing that there is one simple or easy or quick way to come up with keywords. Often you will have to do multiple attempts to find keywords that make sense and retrieve the right amount of material. So let's talk a little bit about another way. Another way can be to actually follow the breadcrumbs or follow the publications of a particular author. So this author, Dr. Daniel Eisenberg, who teaches at Babson College and has previously taught at Harvard and has been quite prolific in publishing, is a good source to talk about and to look at entrepreneurship. He's published many articles in this field, but he's published articles in other fields, as you can see here. He's published in the Harvard Business Review, digital articles, something about business models, real estate management. That looks a little bit different. He has looked at entrepreneurship in a pandemic, so maybe something there will help with his keywords. And he's also looked at training modalities of the futures for externships. So you have to look through and see the types of things that a particular author, somebody prolific like Eisenberg, has done. And often you will find a common set of keywords that help you drill down on a topic, and you can see how a particular author has treated it. And maybe even the author's name becomes a keyword. That can happen in certain areas where the author is really a seminal author and quite prolific in the area. Now, once you've come up with some basic ideas about keywords, you then need to make a few decisions about database sources. And these are the most common ways that this can happen. The first is the Ebsco federated search. And what do we mean by a federated search? Federated search is something that works across multiple databases. Those databases can include a number of different types of articles, can include sometimes books, can include sometimes even blog posts. What types of databases are included is a decision that the library makes when they do a contract with Ebsco and with other providers such as ProQuest about which databases to include. Sometimes, even though the library has specialized sources, they may not be included. This can happen when the publisher does not open up its database to a federated search, and there's a number of reasons they do that, but several of the European journals do not necessarily allow Ebsco or ProQuest in a federated search to see all of their collections, and there's some competitive reasons for that in terms of the alignment to European publishers or Asian publishers in the case of the Chinese sources. Scopus is a database which can be accessed directly with the university ID or sometimes directly through a university library, and it has a fairly broad set of journals. Scopus is a system of ranking and rating journals in terms of impact factors and citations and a number of different metrics about the quality of the journal. But in doing that, they then allow access to all the different journals. Web of Science is similar. It's a Thomson Reuters service. This is not in the Walden collection for those listening who are in Walden, but it is in other libraries. And what this is very similar to Scopus. It has a slightly different focus, and it similar types of ways of getting to articles. Google Scholar is an interesting one, which has definitely improved in terms of its reach and its quality. One thing to note about Google Scholar is even though you put in specific search terms, which we'll talk about in some of the following slides, Google will do synonyms or similar types of terms based on your search history. So if you have multiple scholars working on the same project, they may actually get different results from Google Scholar. Others can be dissertation databases, which certain universities maintain separately from Ebsco or ProQuest. Downloaded reference lists, which some universities also have in what are called LibGuides or library guides or research guides. And there's a number of sources like that. That will depend a little bit on the university, and sometimes you find these through Google Scholar, sometimes directly through a university library. Now you may use several of these together. You may not have to. Some universities, for example, require that all systematic reviews use both a combination of Scopus and Web of Science. And there's a process to go through to retrieve both sets of data, put them together, and reduce and remove the unneeded duplicates in that case. Google Scholar has some issues in the sense that it has a broader reach, and many of the things pulled into Google Scholar may be just simply web pages, so they lack the guarantees of a peer-reviewed or refereed publication that we often require in a scholarly setting in terms of doing literature reviews. Search strings. The ways to develop these are as follows. You will be inputting the search string directly, so you have to write out the search string or type it out, and then you will later probably use sub-searches to refine what you do, and I'll give you a quick example of that. There's three examples here on this page. The first example is a supply chain example, and there's a couple things you see here. First of all, they've used the connector OR, so any of these terms that show up in the searched material will cause the material to be returned as a hit. And we have then some synonyms that are used, some similar terms. Supply, demand, value are one, and then we go from chain network and chain network back and forth as another way that that's described. These are terms of art, but they're used differently. Different authors, different companies use different terms in this field. String 2 shows the use of literals in the sense of things in a quote with no asterisk, lead time compression, reduction, whatever. Those terms must be returned exactly, but the use of the OR, Boolean connector, allows any of those terms to cause the article or the particular scholarly contribution to be returned. String 3 uses a combination of the wildcard, as you see, followed agile, and speed, but again with the Boolean operator OR, which will return any of those as the hit for that article. Here's an example from the Walden Library. It's using the Ebsco Federated search, which Walden uses. And first of all, we're going to enter the search terms. And what we've entered here is a search for collaboration, articles about collaboration in entrepreneurship education. So you'll note that I've used a wildcard, shortened collaboration. And so what this does is picks up collaboration, collaborative, collaborations, plural, those. I've then used a Boolean operator AND, which means that anything before and after the AND must be in the article for it to be returned or retrieved. I've then shortened with a wildcard entrepreneur for entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial, as two possible variations of that word. And then I've used the quotes to require the exact return of the word education. Second, once you have executed that search, you download the search results. So let's look at what that looks like. There will be a shared button that you click, and then it will open up to this field. And what you notice is at the very bottom it says export results, email a link to download exported results, up to 3,715. We don't want that. That's too many results. So what that says when we use this search that I'm showing you right here, that we've gotten too many results. How do we fix that? Well, we do another search, and you'll notice here what I've added is a fourth term. I've added a shortened version of competency with a wildcard to be able to get competence, competency being the main two terms, and I've used and. And what happens there? Click on the share button, and you'll notice that I only have 330 results. So that's a much better situation. That is then able to be analyzed in your citation manager and or a qualitative data analysis program. Once you have clicked on that, it will then come with a pop-up screen that asks you to put your address in, and you will do that. And my suggestion is in the comments box to actually put your search string so that when you get the email, you will remember what it's for, because sometimes you may be doing multiple searches and there is a delay often in getting the email, so it's good to be able to have some record of what you were searching for when you sent this. Very important is to send this in RIS format. This is what you will use in Zotero to import it into your citation manager. And then you click on send. You will then get an email that looks something like this with a link to a zip file. And inside that zip file is that RIS file that I mentioned. Click on the link, and then you will want to import the RIS file into Zotero, which I'm showing right here. And this is the desktop version of Zotero. I am showing the Mac version. It looks fairly similar in the PC version. You simply go to File and Import, and you will import the RIS file, which is contained in the zip archive, and then you'll get the ability to look at it in detail. And what that looks like is something like this. You note that I've imported that search. It had 330 results. What I then do is go through and look for duplicates, and you'll notice already if you go down just a few that we have a design-based learning approach for fostering sustainable competency. There's a slight difference in the creator, so that may be a duplicate. So you go through and eliminate duplicates. There may be some spurious things that come in, and that 330 will quickly fall to a smaller number. You'll notice that it has also imported a number of critical information pieces about the article, including the abstract, and you may well use the abstract to decide whether to keep the article in a data set or not. If you wish, at this point in time, a quick way to categorize these is simply to move the most relevant articles based on a review of the abstract into another part of your library, and then you have a subset already, and you have done the first step of reducing the number of potential references that you will fully analyze. Your next steps are to review the files in Zotero and include the most relevant in a new group. Then go out and attach the PDFs for the relevant files. And you do this by going to the particular document in the library, download the PDF, and upload it. There are some efforts to automate that in some of the citation managers. What we have seen with firewalls and various types of protections that libraries and database providers have in place is this often doesn't work very well. You can try it if you wish. You may consider moving the reference list and PDFs out to a separate file folder in a process and looking at them in more detail using a qualitative analysis program such as Atlas TI, NVivo, or MaxQDA. All are very good for looking at a literature review and creating an in-depth analysis of the literature. In analyzing it in any of these programs, typically you are looking at not only the abstract and the basic information about the article, but the full text of the article. And these programs are very useful and complex and functional in that area. We'll cover some of the later steps about how to actually subcode those documents in a subsequent video. And here are some helpful sources. Two sources from the SAGE publications in the area of research, and I would definitely recommend Miller and Brewer. Very helpful, and if you look at some of the chapters in that, and in particular Phelps, Fisher, and Ellis, Effective Literature Searching, a bit of a dated publication, but still very, very helpful in terms of how you would conduct these types of searches. And last but not least, I really recommend that if you have chosen a particular qualitative data software, such as NVivo, Atlas TI, or MaxQDA, that you consult the vendor, because often they have sample databases, they have white papers, or a number of other processes that can help you learn how to do this systematic literature review, bring it into their analysis software, and do the subsequent coding that we'll talk about in future videos. And with that, I'm at the end of my time. I appreciate your attention to this video and hope it's been helpful. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at my email address. Thank you very much.